today the kind of repression that you see from Islamic authorities in Iran is as brutal and as grotesque as it is in cyberspace as it is on the streets.
I'm Rob Forsyth, and this is Liberalism in Question, a series of podcasts from here at the Centre for Independent Studies, when we look at questions regarding classical liberalism, its strengths, its weaknesses, how it's faring, what kind of challenges it faces, and some of the varieties of its opportunities and threats. I'm delighted to say that my guest today is Behnam Ben Taleblu. Behnam is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington DC, rather, in the US. He is a native Farsi speaker and the senior analyst on Iran. And my topic today is liberalism and Iran. Behnam, I suppose this should be the shortest episode because what on earth has liberalism got to do with Iran, a Islamic republic which seems to be at war with liberalism throughout the world?
It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me, Rob. A great admirer from your podcast from quite a distance back in the States where I live and work. But to get to the heart of your question, there is a sharp contrast because while the state is an authoritarian and Islamist state, it's tamping down or repressing a version of, you could say, folk liberalism married with nationalism that has been bubbling up in various iterations of street protest that is actually organic in that society. So while you have the veneer of it on the hard candy coating, if you will, a desire to retain that form of political Islam that exists in Iran, using the use of force within society, you have actually, again, this folk version of liberalism, the quest for agency, the prioritization of the individual, the rights, the push for free assembly. And then when you marry that with the century-long quest within that society for representative government against various forms of domestic tyrannies, then you actually do get a much greater, broader conversation about the quest for this form of classical liberalism within Iran.
So your classical liberalism has got a history in Iran.
Indeed, it does have a history. There's a history of Iranian several centuries ago engagement with the West, first commercial, then military, then even economic and political. In fact, countries like Great Britain, for example, were essential in the success of Iran's constitutional movement. Some may not know that the Russia-Iran partnership, or dare I even say alliance today, has some unfortunate ancient roots, perhaps not ancient, but unfortunate century-long roots. The Russians bombed Iran's nascent parliament building back in the early 1900s, whereas the grounds of the British embassy in Tehran were used as places, bast is the Persian word, but were really used as places where political actors could take refuge, both from central authority as well as from foreign forces, and to discuss their quest for what they called then in Persian edalat khane, or a house of justice, which a century later there is still unfortunately no independent judiciary in Iran.
Now take me back, assume, and this is a very wise assumption, that I'm not a great expert on Persian or Iranian history. It's true. Go back to the 19th century. Iran has a Shah, a kind of king, but at the same time there was a political movement for liberal reform. Is that what you're saying?
Indeed, the 2,500 years of Iranian history, one of the most important enduring actors, an actor that is a defender of tradition and an actor that's a defender of stasis, is the monarchy. Over the past hundreds of years, it's found different forces within society, whether it was religious forces, commercial forces, intellectual forces, or even military forces, to prop itself up. By the time you got to the 1800s, and as much of the broader Islamic world was asking that question that Bernard Lewis asked, many years ago when he wrote that book, What Went Wrong, when they too were defeated by European armies that they thought they could immediately beat, armies like the Russian forces in the Caucasus in the early 1800s, they too began to ask themselves what went wrong, why, or what happened. And thus began a whole series of both elite as well as social quests for a way to fill that void. Nationalism would come later, but proto-liberalism, you could say, Islamism was born in this era. as well as attempts to actually reform the monarchy. They actually were successful with the constitutional revolution in creating a constitutional monarchy, which was later abridged. And then you had, again, as the state grew in authority, central authority meant greater capacity for authoritarianism. And you've actually had Iran have several different movements: the oil nationalization crisis, 1950s, the tobacco revolt in the late 1890s, social press back on many different kinds of concessions given to Europeans in the 1800s and 1900s, leading ultimately to the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And there is a great line, I think, by an Oxford-trained Persianist, James Buchan. I did a review of one of his books called Days of God. I'm going to paraphrase one of the last lines from his book, but he says about the 1979 revolution, which moved from the Iranian Revolution to the Islamic Revolution, and in many ways was a setback or part of that quest for individual agency and representative government. He said, what the Iranians most wished for, they never gained, and what they sought to preserve, they lost. I think with the perspective and distance of 45 plus years from that revolution, that quote continues to ring true as you see the continuing iterations of boom and bust protests in Iran, most notably the 2022-2023 Women-Led Freedom.
I'll come to that in a moment. Go back. What was it they wished for but did not gain?
They wished for representative governments. They wished for a government that reflected their views, values, and interests.
And what was it they did not wish for but got?
Ultimately, they got a 7th or 6th or 7th century despotism with the power of 20th and later 21st century state authority that was able to basically not just control the public space or the public square, but to take that authoritarianism and move that into the private sphere. Today, the kind of repression that you see from Islamic authorities in Iran is as brutal and as grotesque as it is in cyberspace as it is on the streets.
Now, Iran is massive majority Islamic country. Am I right? So therefore, there are Iranians who are Islamic, but also open to liberalism.
Well, this is actually interesting because yes, they may be of a Islamic faith background, but there is a quite a bit of variation there. You know, there's a differentiation between orthoprax and orthodox, and even from very limited polling that is able to be done, there is a great pull away from this traditional faith, from the 12-verse Shiite creed in Iran. And indeed, you have the opposition to the state-sponsored Khomeini's interpretation of that 12-verse Shiite creed, basically begetting in society a return to Iran or Persia's pre-Islamic roots. You see that in small acts of protest that include things like wearing ties by certain members of Iranian society, certainly not the political elite, because they retain that, again, that monopoly. But within society, the use of these or wearing of these Zoroastrian pendants of the Frabahar, again, an homage to Persia's pre-Islamic past and pre-Islamic glories as symbols of small social forms of protest. But then again, these are scaled up by the fact that agnostic adherents are growing in Iran, as well as atheism is growing in Iran, as well as a form of neo-Protestantism is growing in Iran.
Neo-Protestantism, wow. I was going to make the point that in the West, the rise of liberalism does accompany, as it were, the privatization of religion. That's not quite, it's not that simple, but you know what I mean. The state no longer enforcing a particular religious ideology comes to become a guarantee or a guarantor of a more pluralist world, and that's certainly what we've got in the West for its strengths and weaknesses. For Iran to regain its liberalism, something like that's going to have to happen there as well.
Well, we have a fundamentally different paradigm that we're looking at here, which is a paradigm of mosque and state rather than church and state. And there's a great book that I'll borrow from the title of. It's actually not a book about political liberalism. It's a series of biographies put together called The Nixon and Kissinger Partners in Power. But I love that phrase, partners in power, because for the past half millennia, some of the main elements of the Iranian political state have been the proto-clergy as well as the monarchy. And they've been partners in power with a different level of hierarchy and a different level of political interplay between each other, where in the 1500s and in the 1600s, clearly the monarchy was the dominant force and the clergy was a subservient subsidiary force. In the late 1700s and into the 1800s, these really became partners in power, where to enforce state edicts, plus with the growing control of Twelver Shiism as the official religion of that country, the clergy, which interestingly in Islam there's the saying, which is in Arabic they say la rohanya fi Islam, or there is no clergyhood in Islam. Yet ironically, you have a robust clergy structure in Iran, and one that continues to be scaled up in the past half millennia as political power grows and becomes more Shiite and Islamic in its character and in its color. And then, interestingly, into the 20th century, during the period of modernization, yes, the clergy's wings are clipped, and there's the push for nationalism. But under the middle part of the 1900s, with the last king of Iran, and ironically, he's the only king on record in Iranian history of actually having performed one of the major Islamic rituals, the Hajj ritual, the pilgrimage to Mecca. It is an Islamic revolution that overtakes him. And one reason many historians have pointed out as to why is because while there was still quite a bit of privatization or dispossession from power of religion in that society and religion in that political sphere, one institution that was allowed to grow despite the otherwise authoritarian crackdown against, what you could call constitutionalists, nationalists, the left and the far left, was the religious institutions. And so ironically, given the fact that this was the only free and available political space, and there was a demonstrated political track record of religious activism, the Iranian Revolution became the Islamic Revolution and overturned that partners in power dynamic, but fundamentally has grafted itself onto the structure of authoritarian central government, such that today Ali Khamenei, the country's supreme leader, and that is a title meant to be taken rather literally, wears essentially his turban as if it's a crown and wields more power through both religious and political edicts than any king or any cleric in the past 500 years combined.
So it was a serious mistake for the state or for the Shah to clamp down on liberal and even left-wing groups, but not keep the clergy in place, because it meant that he actually stopped the very forces that may have led to a more liberal society developing. He played into the hands of the authoritarians.
That is one of the theses that comes out, but one controlling factor on that, of course, is that the late Shah of Iran ruled during the period that the world was really split in two between the U.S. and the USSR, and we can't discount the effect of the radical left during the Cold War. And in particular, I think he had a very famous saying about an alliance whose ugly head I fear we see rearing in the West today, where liberalism is under assault from different corridors. And it's not to take our conversation away from what is happening in Iran, but it is to note the trajectory and the correlation of forces towards illiberal ends. Because in Iran during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you had elements of the far left fail and then bleed into armed revolt, and then be willing to be merged with elements of the hard Islamist right and challenge the limited social, economic, and ultimately political freedoms that existed then, which again I would stress were limited, that led into the authoritarian state structure that you have post-1979 with the Islamic Republic.
It was the extremes, in a sense, against the middle, you're saying, effectively.
Yes, and the late Shah called it, I think, the green and black, or the red and green, or the one was the Islamist, one was the Marxist. It was this unholy alliance that he had spoken. But you see that actually Islamists and leftists having the same correlation of forces on, unfortunately, American campuses, Australian campuses, European campuses, and it's a very potent threat.
What is I mean, I've noticed this, many have. It strikes me at one level as very odd. And people often say, you want to support Hamas? Go and live there for a while. You want to support Iran? Go and live there. You'll find it very oppressive. Do you think the left and the hard Islamic right are bedfellows because they've got the same enemy? Is it to do with co-belligerency rather than anything else? Or is there something deeply in both of them, an authoritarian perfectionism, authoritarian millennialism, as a word, that brings them together?
I think it's all of that, and the willingness to, at least of each group, for the left to take on the language of oppressor and oppressed from the Islamists, and for the Islamists to take on the class paradigms of the left, that also allow them to marshal both lexicon and street power, as well as, okay, this is the 21st century, social media power, against those bastions of, what you could call, what President Nixon called in America the great silent majority, or what's left of classical liberalism. And together, that mutual targeting is very dangerous, because the greater they coexist in the same space, the more they correlate, cohabitate, and work with one another towards the eradication of those ends, even though their totalitarian ideologies will not accept one another.
So what happens when there's an Islamic revolution? What happened to the Marxists then? Did they survive only one side can win. You can't have both sides. You can't have two incompatible autocracies ruling in the same place, can you?
It's a great lesson for the in Europe and Australia and America today, to note that who are they getting in bed with? Because while the Iranian Revolution became the Islamic Revolution, and it was a large group of social forces, ever since the revolution was declared victorious on February 11th, 1979, that broad spectrum was consistently narrowed. And it is, narrowed in some of the most brutal and violent ways, such that in the 1980s, the elements of that left were purged and brutally purged.
Yes.
Including in some of Iran's prisons. While the 8-year war with neighboring Iraq was dominating headlines, the regime was dominating on the home front in a very violent and vicious way as well. So again, these totalitarian ideologies leave little to no space for the other. And there is a constant purity test that goes on. In Persian, the words that they use are khodi and ghayr khodi, or of the self and not of the self. And that's a spectrum that continues to narrow over time. And it not only narrows due to the use of force, but it narrows due to politics, because that which was acceptable yesterday is not acceptable today.
This is permanent revolution. It's a mark of almost all revolutions. They devour themselves. Yesterday becomes, we see it all in place. Before I ask about the more recent events, there is an argument that liberalism is a product of Christendom. It arose in a context of, it was a difficult birth. I'm not for a minute saying it's simple, but a difficult birth out of both the positive inputs of the Christian church with its Jewish background, but also in a sense in revolt against some of the control and power of the church, its own authoritarianism. But it does mean it was a uniquely contingent phenomenon. Now, the fact there's liberalism in Iran mean that that's not true, or did they get it from Europe?
Well, some of the great kind of, you could say, they used to use the Arabic word, fikr, or now the Persian word roshan fikr. It means enlightened thinker or enlightened thinker. These folks in the mid to late 19th century and into the early 20th century did draw significantly on the writings, the readings, the travelogues of many classical European thinkers. Such that, one of the major prime ministers and ministers of the court of the father of the late Shah of Iran was this individual named Furughi, who one of his tomes was for over a century taught at Tehran University, and it's called The Path of Wisdom in Europe, and it goes from Plato all the way up until the late modern era philosophers, and he brilliantly has translated and distilled into modern Persian prose this intellectual evolution into Persian, and sought to bring that into the academic level discussion. Unfortunately, that is not at all represented in politics today, but it is, yes.
That's an amazing story. Although it must have taken real courage for a Persian to praise a Greek philosopher, though.
You'll be hard pressed to find Iranians that are holding on to the Battle of Marathon, or that Iranians will not run marathons because of that ancient rivalry.
They've got over it. And also, you guys also gave the Romans a very hard run for their money as well, I must say.
Especially with the Parthians, with the Sasanians,
exactly.
Crassus. Exactly.
Yes, indeed. Well, we mustn't dwell on past successes. My question is, so there was a tradition which was informed by Western thinking that was alive in Iran. I must say, I had not known that. That's very interesting. Now, there was more recently a terrible a failure of an attempt to try and liberalise, which led to the death of that woman over her head covering. I think that's. Can you tell me a little more about that uprising that occurred more recently and why it's failed?
Sure. So since the 1979 revolution, which was a popular street revolution, which unfortunately ushered in this authoritarian Islamist nexus that we see today, since that phenomenon, there actually have been street protests against the regime. One of the interesting things is, though, in the 1990s and early 2000s, there were political events that were met with political protests. For example, the 1999 university protests were triggered by not just the storming of Tehran University, but the closing of a major reformist newspaper. In 2009, the Green Movement, which you may remember, was a reformist protest by large swaths of the elite in Tehran and then outwards from that capital in response to a stolen election away from a reformist president. But from the really hard militant clampdown by the state of elements within the society and elements within the state to try to reform itself, society moved away from reform and towards wholesale revolution altogether. There's a saying in Persian that comes from actually a movie, a movie that was quite popular in the early 2000s called Marmulak, or Lizard. And the saying is, when you try to push people into heaven, they'll pop out of the other side of hell. So it's the negation of that which the state, through control and through violence, will try to do unto a society. And with the militant policing of the headscarves through a believe it or not, a police force called the morality police, you got pushbacks and major, bottom-up pressure from society against the state, such that today you have massive political protests across Iran, not triggered by political events, but triggered by inherently non-political events, triggered by environmental crises, triggered by foreign policy issues, triggered by economic and labor issues, and as you mentioned, triggered by social issues like the veil. And the pushback against the state in all of these areas, and the fact that rather than being led from the capital and out, these are demographically and geographically diverse protests that happened in 2022, 2023, from the outside in, tells you how organic and how deep-seated this evolution towards revolution has been, such that any symbol of the state, any symbol of the Islamist clampdown on individual autonomy, and in particular women's autonomy. And unfortunately, we know that's a challenging and, to put it politely, contested relationship between women's individual autonomy and, traditional Orthodox Islamic practices, leads to these boom and bust cycles of protest in Iran that we see today.
The present president is often said in the West to be a reformer. Is that true?
He comes from a group that I call statist reformists. He's no reformist in the political or philosophical sense. He's somebody who I think is willing to function for this regime as lipstick on a pig, in a sense that by simply changing his style, he is hoping to elicit the change in substance from Western policy. This is where I think our conversation can bleed into policy if you wish, but this man has no philosophically different view of the way things should be done at home. And you don't have to take it from me. He wrote an op-ed that lays out his worldview, where he says nothing about protests led by brave university students in his own country for many years that his own regime has clamped down on, but he's supporting and he's running intellectual cover for Western university students who he says are not anti-Semites, and he applauds them for protesting against Israel.
Well, let me come to that issue, because at the time of recording, and I assume it'll be for quite a while still, Iran is the centre, through its proxies and its own self, of a very rejectionist, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, I suspect, alliance. And it's at the centre of people's thinking about the Arab and Persian world. And it's the main player, I think, you'd say. The other Arab states are much quieter. What's going on there?
I'm glad you connected the dots, sir, because for policy audiences sometimes halfway around the world, where I am currently, as well as back in Washington, where I live and work, there is a great tendency to disconnect the dots. The Islamic Republic sits at the helm of a constellation of terror forces, proxy forces, regional militias that don't thrive in the successful states of the Middle East, or where there is the potential for change, even incremental. They thrive in failed states, and they have an ideology that is ascendant among the downtrodden and dispossessed. And eerily, what the Islamic Republic has tried to do despite having in its own vernacular an ecumenical transnational Islamist mission to get the societies to revolt against the pro-status quo order. Famously, the founding father, if you will, of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, he believed the liberal order would collapse, but he also penned a letter to Gorbachev in the 1980s saying that the communist order would collapse. But they are people who distrust the regional balance, are trying to overturn the regional balance, and they would like that overturning to go to the global level as well. And they had three major impediments. One was the monarchy at home. Two was Israel in the region, and three was the role of America in the world. And that's why they call Israel the little Satan and America the great Satan. And post-October 7, what the regime has been doing is fighting a war via these proxies. It calls this large constellation of terror and proxy forces the axis of resistance. They quite literally style themselves as the axis. And it has been able to surge weapons, even state-level weapons, into the hands of many non-state actors to encircle Israel as part of a larger ring of fire strategy. And this ring of fire allows them to, on the cheap and from a distance and not from Iranian territory, adjudicate this larger ideational conflict that they have with Israel directly and with the West indirectly.
So the regime is fighting liberalism externally as well as internally.
Indeed, and it marries even its opponents. If you look at the hardline press in Iran, it talks about the successes of rolling back Zionism, given that, for example, in the north of Israel today, you have 60 to 80,000 people internally displaced who have had to go south. And given that, I think for the first time since the 1967 war, you have towns and villages in Israel that are empty. I think there's 40 plus ghost towns in North Israel. So they see the fact that Israel has had to move back as a ideological and a political success. And, they link these characters together. They talked about fighting, quote unquote, the Zio-Wahhabi alliance. So they've been quite aware in their hardline media of the rising potential for peace and deepening political and economic relationships between the Israelis and the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, and in particular between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which I believe would be a positive game changer for the region.
Yes, indeed. So you say that again, Zio-Wahhabi, that's an incredible combination. Wahhabi Islam and Jewish Zionism, that's a strange bedfellows. Now, I want you to become a prophet. I know it's very dangerous being a prophet because about the future. Let me put a couple of scenarios by you. All this attack on Zionism depends upon the hope that Israel can actually be defeated in some way. And that's the hope. And my feeling is that the Arab states have decided that's not going to happen, and therefore we need to find an accommodation. But not so Iran. But if there is a war or some serious engagement, my bet is Iran will lose badly. I could be wrong on this, but will lose badly, and it'll be exposed as a lot weaker than it's pretending to be. Am I being realistic here? And if it is the case, would this be the kind of shake-up that might lead to the collapse of that regime and the opening of possibilities of a more liberal, generous Iran, albeit with the majority Muslim population?
Well, I certainly think if you have a collapse of this of the Islamic Republic at home, you would have, again, most of the venom taken out behind this axis of resistance in the region. But I would say one thing, that end state can be achieved not only through, military force. I think that certainly the Islamic Republic has to be defeated and rolled back, particularly given that in many of the areas today where Western policymakers seem to say, oh, there is no military solution, the Islamic Republic and its constellation of terror and proxy forces have somehow managed to find a military solution, whether that's cementing the Houthis in Yemen or bailing out the Assad regime in Syria. But to the home front, I think so long as the West is willing to engage in both statecraft and soulcraft, is willing to actually take an objective look at the region and to understand, as you connected the dots early in this conversation, that the major arsonist in the region is this regime, and that we have an opportunity by actually standing with this increasingly protesting populace, which has moved from reform towards revolution. One can engage in a policy of maximum pressure on the regime and maximum support for the people, and in so doing, actually perhaps be able to avoid a region-wide war. There are many things short of a shooting war that expose the political shortcomings and the economic shortcomings and the kleptocracy and the corruption of the ruling elite today. I think real creativity on this side and understanding of the regime's threat assessment that they may think they can win different rounds of an Israel-Iran war or an Iran-America war, but they cannot win a war against their own people over time, because that is where the line really is going in the opposite direction.
I'm not speaking from knowledge, but I think they can't win an Israeli-American war either. I think that they'll find if they. I mean, I'm not advocating a war, but there was one. I think the results may, in the long run, be better than who knows. It may lead to the over, right? I think they'd lose. I think they would lose.
Here's how I would frame it. You know, these guys love to rattle the saber, and you see a sharp contrast in military performance and military effectivity.
That's what I'm referring to.
Between exactly April 13, April 14, they fired 300 plus missiles, drones at Israel. Barely were able to land a punch, even though they did strike at a few bases. Didn't destroy those bases, but were able to destroy a runway, hit part of a wall, what have you. But the Israelis, with much less military force, were able to cause much more damage on April 19th. I think they understand that. You know, these guys love martyrology, love fighting to the last Arab, love fighting to the last Muslim, but certainly are quite keen to live in this life as much as they want to live in the next life. And I think the prudent use of force outside of Iranian territory can actually go quite a long way. For example, I'm an American. Look at the region through an American security lens only, post-October 7. U.S. positions have been struck 175 times by Iran-backed forces. The U.S. has only kinetically responded 11 times. That's a very poor response ratio, and that's why we have the deterrence shortcomings in the region that we do today.
Yes, I believe that you can get peace, but often you have to have victory first. Behnam, can I ask you to be more, just as we come to the end of this interview, I thought would hardly have anything, because Iran and liberalism, turns out I was completely wrong. It's a very rich and delightful subject to be talking about, despite some of the problems we've talked about. Long term, are you optimistic? Are you hopeful? Maybe optimistic is not quite the right word. Are you hopeful for the success of liberalism in Iran? Whether you'll live to see it, I don't know. Whether you'll live to see it, I don't know.
Well, let's hope we all live to see it, but yes. Very long term, yes, I am. The problem is it could be very long term. I think this phrase was used by former Israeli president talking about Arab-Israeli peace, Shimon Peres. He said, the good news is there's light at the end of the tunnel. The bad news is there's no tunnel. I think certainly the Iranian population today has shown us that there is a tunnel. I think we have to really double down and find ways to support them creatively, cleverly, strategically, because this is, with the exception of Israel in the region, one of the areas where you can have a confluence of strategy and a confluence of values in that part of the world. I would also use the word, folk liberalism or proto-liberalism.
Yes.
Just to, keep it as intellectually honest and consistent as possible. We're still quite a bit away from a John Locke or a John Rawls situation.
I know.
The quest for representative government, an independent judiciary, individual agency, bodily autonomy, freedom, the triumph of agency over structure, yes, all those forces are pointing at least socially in the right direction.
And the media, social media, which got a lot of downs and ups as well to it, means it's hard for people to be isolated from some of these. They see it's available now. It's hard to keep it quiet that these things exist and people flourish under it.
And the failures of their own government quiet as well.
I've been speaking with Behnam Ben Taleblu, is that correct? I'm not good at my Farsi pronunciations, from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, a think tank in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Behnam. It's been most enlightening. I must say I've come away from this both better informed and, strange enough, more hopeful about the future of Iran. I'm Rob Forsyth. This is Liberalism in Question. Thank you for joining us.